Consortium about her research, followed by a discussion on Illinois policy implications from my colleague, Rebecca Vonderlack Navarro, Director of Education Policy and Research. And we will close with a discussion on the Chicago Public School context and policy from Jorge Macias, Chief of Language and Cultural Education, and Leslie McKinley, Deputy Chief of Early Childhood Education for Chicago Public Schools. As a former English learner in Chicago Public Schools, I am thrilled to introduce this research. But before I do, I want to take a moment to share some of the strengths and assets many of you are already bringing to this conversation. I'm seeing teachers as probably one of my favorite responses on the screen, because our teachers are the #1 resource in classrooms for English learners as they develop their English and build on their home language. Commitment to the success of English learners, family involvement, and a commitment to the ESL bilingual program within your building. That's awesome. Active, engaged, joyful, in-person learning with quality curricular materials. A strong EL committee and collaboration to create our school's language assessment. Any more responses rolling in? Well, that's an awesome framing for a way to begin our conversation today around what are some of the assets that these classrooms bring to our young ELs and how those assets contribute to their long-term success in school. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marisa de la Torre, who can give us a deep dive on this new research. Marisa?
Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to the fund for organizing this event. I am really excited to be able to share the research with you. And I also really excited to hear your questions and actually learn from your experiences. So we did this study focused on pre-K and early grade years, just focus on the English learners that attend Chicago public schools. And the motivation for the study comes from a prior study and a couple of things that we learned. One is, next please, that most of the English learners in Chicago public schools are concentrated in the early grades. As you can see here, the height of the bar represents the number of the students that are ELs in different grades in a particular year. And what we see is that the concentration tends to be in the early grades. And as English learners master the English skills that they need to pass the access test, they lose the designation of English learners, and we see a decline after fourth, fifth grade. We know that usually it takes 5 to 7 years to acquire the academic language that the access test is testing to demonstrate English proficiency in this area. And actually, another thing that we learned by looking at the data is in some years, the kindergarten classes in CPS are comprised of 1/3 of English language learners, right? So it's important to know how to support English learners better. But one thing that we also learned is that 20% of the students that started in CPS as English learners did not reach proficiency by 8th grade, despite being enrolled in CPS for since kindergarten. And what it was really apparent by looking at the access test, this graph shows different performance in the access test for two groups of ELs. The green line is those that became proficient in 3rd grade. The yellow line is those that did not reach proficiency by 8th grade. And what we noticed is like it was very, it started early on with differences among those two groups. So this led us to ask ourselves the following two questions, which we try to answer in the study. One is, what are the factors associated with the stronger outcomes for ELs in pre-K and early grades? Because we know that what happens in the early grades really influences their future academic performance, right? So, And also importantly, given what we learned in the prior study, is to what extent can schools identify EAs who will benefit from the additional support. So if we find supports early on, can we identify those students that might benefit from those? So that's basically what we try to do in the study. We only focus on EAs enrolling a CPS school. We focus on a couple of cohorts of students that were in pre-K, and we follow them to kindergarten, around 14,000 EAs. And we focus on 3 cohorts of students that started in kindergarten, which were around 16,000 students, and we follow them all the way to 3rd grade. We, in CPS, just to give you a little bit of context, 85% of EAs are Spanish speakers. And then the rest, they actually speak more than 70 different languages. So there is a wide variety or diversity. And also, it's important to know that most of the English learners students in CPS are receiving free and reduced price lunch. So I'm just going to share a few key findings. The first question that we were asking is what factors are associated with the stronger outcomes. We found 2 things. The first one is students that were enrolled in preschool, especially full-day programs, was associated with stronger learning outcomes and attendance for English learners. It's important to keep in mind that when I say enrollment in preschool, we are only looking at enrollment in a CPS preschool. So we don't have data on the students that have enrolled in private preschools. We don't have data on the students that have enrolled in community-based preschools. So this is based on the students enrolled in a CPS preschool. And what we, for example, I'm going to show you a graph to give you an idea of the differences that we see in outcomes. This represents the percent of the students that were proficient on assessment that is given at the beginning of kindergarten, which is the text reading and comprehension, the DRC, that measures the early literacy skills of the students. And what you see is like students that have attended a half-day pre-K, 39% of those were able to demonstrate proficiency based on this test. And compared to 49% of full-day pre-K students. So if we compare two similar groups of students in many different dimensions, and the only difference is whether they attended a half-day or a full day, we see huge, large significant differences in the early literacy skills. What I also want you to keep in mind is that only 19% of EAs that enroll in a preschool in CPS attended a full-day preschool. And that's a low number compared to an average of 34 students attending a full-day pre-K. And it's not just that we see benefits or associated with attending pre-K in kindergarten readiness, but we also see effects that follow them all the way to 3rd grade. So and in many different dimensions, in attendance, in standardized test scores, GPA. So it's like a wide range of benefits in many different outcomes. Now, the second factor that was associated with better outcomes for EAs was whether they were receiving bilingual services. And one of the things, there are not that many students in CPS that refuse services or their families refuse services. It's just around 3%. But we noticed that when they reached 3rd grade, they were less likely to be proficient in English measured by the access test compared to students that had received bilingual services education. And we know that by 3rd grade, we know that it takes time, right, between 5 to 7 years to acquire the skills. But this is just to notice that if you're immersed in an English environment where you don't receive any supports, in acquiring English skills, eventually your performance is going to decline. And we see that not only in acquiring English skills, but we see it in a wide range of outcomes. We see it in attendance, we see it in standardized tests, we see it in grades, right? So the supports that bilingual services provide to the students, it actually shows in many different dimensions, not just in acquiring English skills. Now, moving to the second question, can we identify students early on? And we found 2 things that I want to share with you. The first one is the screener test that the students take within 30 days of enrollment. really seems to be associated with outcomes, with future outcomes. Especially students with low levels of English proficiency tended to have lower grades and test performance. We don't see differences in attendance, but we see differences in academic performance. And that's especially true when we look at reading scores. The bars on the left represent NWA average NWA data for different groups of students at different levels of the screener test. The darker bars are the students in the entering levels, which is the lowest one. The lighter gray represents a student in the standing one. So you see big differences in the reading scores. We also see it in math, but it's especially pronounced in reading. And when we look at the access different domains, again, we see that reading and listening seem to be those areas where the students need more support. And finally, we also learned that English learners with identified disabilities had lower attendance and a harder time acquiring English skills. They made progress, but it's at a slower rate compared to other students. But I think the more important part to me is to learn that the attendance was lower, because if they are not in a school, they cannot be getting the services that they need to make more progress. So I just want to conclude with a few considerations given what we just learned for maybe practitioners, maybe policymakers. The first one is we know that attending pre-K, especially a full day, was beneficial. So maybe making a priority group EL students for access to these programs, especially full day, would be important. Bilingual services are beneficial for students that are English learner students. So really practitioners can help families and guardians make informed decisions when they enroll in the schools, and really provide information about the benefits of getting these services. In order to, we also know that we can identify students that might need more support. For example, the screener data that comes from those initial tests right after enrollment can really help practitioners to identify those students that might need more support or differentiated instructional interventions, especially supports around the reading components that seem to be different, and then finally, students with disabilities, practitioners may pay particular attention to them. And one area is to help them get services, right? Both special education services and bilingual services, but also try to understand why attendance is low and help them be there, present in the school in order to receive the services. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to leave you now with Rebecca von der Lack Navarro, who's going to talk about policy implications.
Thank you, Marisa. So this is exciting, having research that validates, I think, what a lot of us already know, and that's the benefits of bilingual preschool. And in fact, Illinois is the only state in the nation that's serving ELs systemically in its preschool for all programs as early as the age of 3. And this research is showing that it works. But you all as educators, and let's go to that next slide here, you're inheriting kids that come from a wide array of preschool options. So they can come from state-funded preschool for all, which go to schools, again, where this study took place, but that money also goes to community-based organizations. Kids also go to Head Start, licensed centers, licensed family childcare, private preschools. And again, we know that these kids get the home language survey, they're screened in their English language proficiency, they have a licensed bilingual educator in our school-based programs. We're still learning how community-based organizations who receive preschool for all dollars are supporting ELs. Actually, we don't think they're equally supported to provide these services. I think there's difficulties because sometimes they get money from PFA, sometimes Head Start, and they have different guidelines for serving these kids. And a lot of these other programs have great guidance for serving ELs, but it's mostly non-regulatory. So you all could be inheriting kids from a preschool that were not receiving these bilingual services. And so in the next slide, we're asking the question as a policy organization, especially now that Pritzker is talking about universal preschool. You all have had universal preschool for a bit in Chicago. How do we ensure English learners, no matter where they are in the system, reach their full potential when preschool programs can vary so much on how they're serving these kids. They can have different governance structures, different academic supports, different definitions for these kids, sometimes different methods for identifying ELs or not even identifying them. And then also really big, different teacher knowledge base. In some programs, it's enough just to have an adult in the room that shares the home language. We know that's not enough. We want a licensed educator with the bilingual ESL endorsement. You need to be specialized on how to do this work. So what we're pushing for at state level policy and in the city of Chicago is a research-based components of an Illinois framework to serve ELs. And for all the bilingual educators, we're taking Article 14C of the bilingual mandate, and we're trying to streamline this across programs. And so what that means is a common definition and identification for these kids. So the same type of home language survey, English language proficiency screener. The second is specialized teacher training. This is probably so obvious to you guys, more than a BA, you got to be licensed. As we know in a lot of programs, just having the BA is enough. And then lastly, structured ESL bilingual programs, because some of these programs, it's still allowed to do English only. And this study is showing that is not the way to go. Lastly, and I know you guys have all seen the screener for this last slide here, and I just wanted to point out, just reiterate what Marisa said about the predictiveness of this screener. And a really important finding that I think is interesting is that kids that came in at level A, that was negatively associated with those long-term third grade outcomes, the reading, the attendance, the math scores. This screener could be a way to prioritize which kids are getting seats in the system as we're still in the midst of rolling out preschool, that they get prioritized for 2 years, full day bilingual pre-K. So just something to think about as practitioners. So I will now pass it to Leslie McKinley, Deputy Director of Early Childhood in Chicago Public Schools.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for allowing me to speak this morning on behalf of the Office of Early Childhood. When I think about English learners, there are two main factors that our office is focused on. That is access and continuity. Next slide, please. As you can see, this slide represents day 20 data from this current school year. We are still being hit with impacts from the pandemic with our enrollment. As you can also see, 23% of our preschool population were identified as English learners. This study highlights the importance of access to quality, full-day preschool programming. And right now in the district, we are happy to report that we have 369 elementary schools which offer preschool programs. Of that 369, 96% of those schools are offering a full day program experience for students. We will continue in our office to increase access to high quality preschool program and really work to advocate for policy changes for continuation between pre-K and kindergarten. Next slide, please. In light of this research, there are specific opportunities for growth for our office. So currently the district serves a little under 5,000 3-year-olds, and there's opportunity for us to identify how we strategically expand 3- and 4-year-old programming in the coming years in light of this new study. Additionally, we want to think about our current work interacting with families. There's opportunity for us to think about how we're using our voice to support and educate families around the different preschool options that are available to them and their benefits. And lastly, we see opportunities for us to continue to look at our professional development and educator supports and more intentionally build teacher practice on supporting ELs in collaboration with our Office of Language and Culture. I will now pass it over to my colleague, Jorge Macias.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted to highlight a few quick points of things we've heard. First, operationally, obviously, has been mentioned, increasing the universal full-day pre-K seats for 4-year-olds, especially English learners, is a primary given the research of this study. Also the long-term evidence that we see in the previous study, as Marisa highlighted. Also increasing seats for 3-year-olds. I think this 3-year-olds were captured in this study, although we didn't speak about it a lot. We need to also increase seats specifically in CPS schools because they have the teachers who can provide those bilingual education services to children. And so we'd like to see more 3-year-olds who are identified as ELs prioritized for seating. And how do we make this happen? I think one of the things that we have to do is to increase the pipeline of bilingual endorsed teachers in pre-K programs, and also bilingual endorsed teachers who also have a background in special education. And those are long-term things that we're working on as a district through cohorts that we work through in our office, as well as initiatives through our talent office to increase this pipeline, because you cannot serve the children if you don't have the teachers. And lastly, the instructional part. I think that's what was highlighted as well. The students in the second finding, you have to receive bilingual education services. That's the second thing we learned from this finding. And so high quality professional development for teachers of ELs to help them with the early English language development skills that are highlighted. And also, we're working on a digital curriculum for Spanish language arts that will include pre-K. It will be pre-K to 12th grade. As Marisa said, 85% of the population of ELs in the district is Spanish speaking. So providing bilingual education service at the optimal level by offering the students an opportunity to become literate in both their home language and English, and offering that Spanish language arts curriculum digitally through our Skyline platform in the fall of 23 is our goal. We hope that these things will start to address some of those areas of growth. We'll talk about more of the current work in the breakout. And then just the opportunities I'd like to highlight. Leslie and I have a long-term relationship. We've been working in both of our offices for, I want to say something like 7 or 8 years together. She's probably been in early childhood longer than I've been in Olse. So I feel very positive going forward about our collaboration to make these things happen. And I'm so grateful for the research from the consortium for both this study and the previous study that's going to give the teachers and the administrators in schools the ammo they need to inform parent decisions. As Marisa highlighted, we don't want parents and families rejecting bilingual education services. You saw the detrimental effect. It's actually even more profound when students continue past 3rd grade. I think the previous study highlighted some of that data as well. So taking this study, taking the prior study, our hope is that our teachers and our administrators in schools will be able to use this brand new research of our own students on a large quantitative scale to demonstrate to parents the benefits of bilingual education and the need for the students to participate in it. So thank you, and I will pass it over back to Erika.
Thank you, Jorge. I don't see any questions in the chat now, but wondering and asking the speakers what other opportunities are available to share some of this new research with parents who are exploring their preschool options and might not know about some of these findings. And I am seeing some other questions populate, but wanted to at least pose that one.
And I'm putting in the chat a link to a fact sheet and video for parents based on the research.
I see here from Sendel, you noted that the most commonly spoken language in Chicago public schools is Spanish. Did you have any additional differences in your findings by different home languages, or do they apply to children with all home languages?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think it applies to all students, regardless of the language, the native language. We saw a few differences. I think outcomes tended to be a little bit stronger if they don't speak Spanish as a native language, but it wasn't like a huge difference. But we are hoping to keep studying this and go deeper and try to understand the reason behind that in future studies.
Thank you, Marisa. There was also a question in the chat about a a one-page summary of the research available to support conversations with parents, particularly those who refuse services initially. I think the link that Rebecca placed in the chat for the one-pager resources and the video resources is a really good way to start that conversation, because it is done in a way where the parents might see themselves in the video and are able to understand the research and how it relates to their decision for preschool. And I think there's also a summary of the research available so that folks who do want to look through some of the findings don't have to go through the full report. There's a summary of it.
And the Latino Policy Forum has been in really positive conversations with CPS about getting the video and the fact sheets out during the pre-K enrollment campaign. FACE was a part of those conversations. We have a really important relationship with the bilingual parent councils too. They were actually the first audience to hear about this research. I think there's more to do. We're close to getting funding, because I'd like to get the video and the fact sheet in other languages, Mandarin, Polish, Arabic. We're working on that. And I'd like to, I think we're gonna get that money. I'd like to work with community-based organizations so the video is also culturally responsive. This video is in Spanish, done with Latinos, and I think we wanna change that if we're communicating to different audiences.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I did get another question, particularly around the workforce. What are some efforts that have been made to partner with local colleges and universities to ensure that teachers can pursue the ESL bilingual endorsement at an affordable price?
Yeah, so we're currently have 5 university partners. We're actually going to the Board of Education tomorrow to renew our cohorts for the next 2 years with local university partners. And these courses are, an average course is costing somewhere between $600 and $800, depending on which partner you choose. And then we provide 50% tuition reimbursement for that. So we expect a typical CPS teacher out of pocket would pay about $300 to $400 per course for a graduate level course. And I think there's 6 of them. So, you know, total programming teacher would be paying out of pocket, we hope, is somewhere a little under $2,000 over the course of be 3 to 4 semesters, depending on, you know, the teacher, how quickly they are completing the program, which is very reasonable for any educator, considering this will make you an invaluable asset to the district and probably give you long-term job security in your career.
I'll also add this: the State Board of Education received a lump sum of money from federal relief through ESSER funds and dedicated 4 of the $9 million for educators on provisional licenses so that they are able to get the bilingual ESL endorsement. And districts who do have that need can apply for those funds and pay for that coursework associated with the bilingual ESL endorsement.
Yeah, I will add, we are in communication with the Illinois State Board of Education. They have not released the application. They indicated that the application will be released in June or July. So we're very excited to apply and hopefully receive a good portion of those funds so that we can expand the cohorts either through our office or the talent office to include more educators in that opportunity.
There's another question in the chat about what additional or current partnerships exist for bilingual dual language student teachers.
In terms of partnerships, are we talking about them becoming employed by Chicago Public Schools? I want a little more clarification on the question to help. Because that's the goal. They're student teachers with us. We want to keep them. I do know that the talent office does run what we call early offers. Typically, CPS hiring cycle starts a little after what we would see in suburban districts. So the way we try to compete is our district tries to contract special education, bilingual education, a couple various need positions prior to the typical window that schools would be able to start hiring teachers. That I want to say that starts in the 2nd semester of the year. So there are don't know if I have a term on partnerships, but there are things that our talent office does to hire teachers before they even have a school, especially in these high need positions, so that hopefully principals will have access to at least a pool of candidates immediately at the opening of the hiring cycle. And if there's any principals on this call, you can reach out to me and I'll give you the name of the talent person to reach out to.
Thank you, Jorge. Now we have a question for all of you to prime us for our breakout discussion. What is one question you are entering the breakout room with after hearing from Marisa regarding the research, Rebecca around the policy implications that happens at the state level with different settings for preschool, and then also what we're hearing around the Chicago public school context from our partners at CPS. You can use the chat to share or raise your hand. And I can read some of these off just to begin brainstorming discussion items for the breakout. Does the research show differences in academic outcomes versus the types of bilingual education received? That's a very good question. And I think a lot of discussion in the development of the research was, how we were able to identify the type of program, whether it's TPI, TBE, or dual language. I think the data was limited in being able to identify the program structure, but I think what this does is gives us something to look forward to with future research on being able to identify whether there are differences between program type. Because I think we would imagine that being in a dual language classroom would likely have the best outcomes, but because of data limitations, we couldn't really draw some of those research implications. Another really good question is around cohorts for the teachers interested to know where to register. And then what are other high leverage steps in terms of policy, evaluation, instruction, and staffing outreach that various stakeholders can take?
Apologize, I was writing in chat the response. If the board approves, we will be next month sharing information sessions with university partners for teachers who are going to be seeking the endorsements. We plan to start at least 3 cohorts this fall, but we have to conduct the information sessions first so that teachers can select a partner, and we could select the school sites that would be hosting and then coordinate that so that we would be ready for a late August, early September start to our cohorts. There was a question earlier about 100% funding for teacher cohorts. If we did 100% funding, the seats would be limited with our current allocation. 100% funding is something we definitely can consider if ISB does allocate some of that $4 million to Chicago Public Schools. And obviously, depending on the size of the amount of the allocation, that would determine if we did a 50 or 100% funding for the cohorts in the future.
I'm also seeing a lot of questions around capacity building, specifically around staffing available in order to roll this out. And I think this is a really good discussion item that we've been elevating as part of our policy implications, but I hope we can take some of these really good questions into the breakout rooms, because I think we'd also want to know from all of you what some of those capacity building opportunities can be that would fit the needs of your school, so that we have that in mind as we kind of continue to brainstorm how we make this in more alignment with the research. So I wanted to take a moment to really thank all of our presenters today. We thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and are thrilled at how relevant this research is to our students' needs, so that we can learn to improve how we serve them. The last portion of today's agenda is to share some of our educator examples. And we are so excited to have the teams from Talcott Elementary School and Lozano Elementary School to talk about their practice and how their research connects with their support of English learner students. We've randomly selected you into breakout rooms with a school team, and they'll share some of their work and open it up for questions. To help them facilitate these conversations, please share one of the questions you have about supporting ELs in your school in the chat, and we'll take a minute to have participants share while we move in the breakout rooms. Now, if you do want to return to the main room at any time, please press leave button and you can leave the breakout room. And if you'd like to stay in this main room and talk to Jorge Macias instead of going out into a breakout room, that's totally an option too.